For those of you who have seen a lot of the videos on this channel, you'd be very familiar with this, my 617 medium format panoramic film camera. I built this over the process of about 1 or 2 months earlier this year. It is based on a half plate view camera, and I designed and 3D printed a film back so I can shoot 617 medium format panoramic images. When I first decided that I wanted to build this camera, it was because I didn't really want to spend the money of something like a Shen Hao 617, which is quite an expensive but nice camera. I wanted to dip my feet into the water of using a view camera such as this, but the amount of money to spend on a Shen Hao was just too much. As such, I built it on this half plate film camera, which at the time I was aware that there was some limitations. The main ones being the amount of movements this style of camera has compared to something like a Shen Hao. Because this camera can fold down quite flat and quite compact, it effectively really only has rise and fall on the front standard, and it has no other movements. The back is locked in place, there's no shift or tilt. My reasoning for why I was okay with this was, as I was learning the entire field camera or view camera process from scratch, I knew that there was going to be a lot of complexity. I was going to be learning a lot. On top of that, designing my own film back, something I'd never done before, learning all the process of that, learning about how to get all of the bits to work together. I felt that if I add in multiple movements on top of that, it was going to be quite complex, and the chances of me just getting too overwhelmed was quite high. So it was okay to begin with, at least, that I didn't really have that many movements available to me. Until recently, when I went to shoot a Taco Bill building here in Australia. We don't have Taco Bell, we have Taco Bill. It's kind of like an old, weird, dodgy knockoff. Now, the location that I was shooting, I had some constraints that I couldn't work around, and it was then that I suddenly thought, oh, maybe a little bit of rise might help. Undoing the locks and then slowly rising up the lens and seeing that on the ground glass, immediately my brain exploded with the possibilities of movements. And pretty much straight away I was like, I need more, I need a Shen Hao. So I made my own. This is a fully 3D printed Shen Hao style view camera that I've been building over the better part of 4 months. So how do you go about 3D printing a camera? Your first step is obviously you need a 3D model. Searching on the internet, there are quite a few high-res images of the Shen Hao 617, so I was able to get those and use those as a reference to see what I was going to have to do. Looking at the images, I didn't see anything in them that seemed to be impossible to do in 3D. There are definitely areas that I knew were going to be challenging and areas I was going to have to learn and get better at what I was doing, but for the most part, I thought everything was doable. In that internet search, I discovered there was a 3D model of Shen Hao 617 available for purchase on TurboSquid. However, it's a 3D model for 3D animation, not for 3D printing. As such, you load it into something like Blender or Softimage or 3D Studio. It looks amazing. It looks like a Shen Hao 617, even down to the leather handle. However, when you start to drill into it, you see that it's designed to look like the camera, but it functionally isn't an actual camera. Many of the parts that didn't need to be weren't even modeled. They were added via texture maps. So for instance, the gears that make the front and the rear standard move back and forth was an image. It wasn't modeled. The gears that ran that track were not modeled. So many elements that basically anything that wasn't visible wasn't modeled at all, and many of the elements that were modeled to look good, not to function. It didn't even come with the film back for the rear, so it had the ground glass modeled in. But even then, the model itself was not dimensionally accurate. Many of the parts, when you measured them, didn't make sense, didn't match up. The rear standard wasn't even the correct form factor for 617. And as such, it wasn't going to be useful, something that I could actually 3D print. What it did, however, give me was an image I could look at and spin around in the computer when I was creating the pieces and see how the they would work with each other, and to visualize that, which I found very useful. Now, when I started modeling the camera, almost immediately I knew that there were going to be certain components that would not really work in PLA. They would not have the structural rigidity that I would need for the camera. And so I thought, there's a good chance to try something out I've never used before, 3D printing of aluminium. So there are the front standard, the rear standard, and a few other bits and pieces. I modeled as normal, and I created in the 3D modeling package as normal. However, I sent those off and had them printed in aluminium using a process called SLA, selective laser, or SLS, selective laser sintering, where they literally use a laser to zap particles of aluminium to create 3D models. So I think probably the easiest way is that I talk about the camera from the front of the camera to the rear of the camera, and we can talk about some of the challenges that I faced along the way of building it. I started with the front lens mount purely because it's the front of the camera, seemed as good a place as any to start, but also because with my previous camera I'd done a little bit of work designing an adapter so that it could support the Linhof style lens board. So I already had that 3D model, so that was a good jumping off point. A little bit of the work had already been done for me. So it was a fairly simple part to model because effectively it is just a rectangle with a hole in it. And it takes a Linhof style lens board like so. And yeah, so it was fairly simple to model. I also modeled the top and bottom retention mechanisms. I actually had those done printed in aluminium for no other reason than I could, which then led me into the first of my challenges, which was the front bracket. I had quite a few high-res images of the Shen Hao. There were a couple of areas that were kind of hard to make out. Shen Hao has a different mechanism for retention on the front standard than I have. It has a little cam, a locking cam, which is great, but after a lot of looking at it and seeing how would I make it, I realized that it was significantly more complicated and offered no real functional benefits to the camera. So I decided to go for a far more simple, just a lock nut. The actual standard moves exactly the same way. It's just probably an extra 2 or 3 seconds to undo, like so, and then also, and then locks in place with a nice little registration. Click there. I did print all of these parts in PLA, and that way when I was sending them off to be printed in aluminium, I was fairly sure that all the parts were exactly how I wanted them. This did definitely show up some limitations in the aluminium printing process. When I got the parts back, there were some tolerance issues, mainly with this front standard. Moving on to the base part of the camera. This was, interestingly, probably the easiest part of the whole camera to design, because really when you look at it and you break it down, it's just a series of rectangles. You've got the base plate, as it were, which is, I printed in PLA, and it's really just a retention for all the other parts. It offers no real strength or rigidity. It just holds all the other parts that do offer the strength. And then you've just got a series of different sized rectangles that either go horizontally and vertically, that are all bolted together in a particular order, that gives you a fairly strong and stable base for the rest of the camera to sit on. Probably the most complicated part was the gearing. I knew that basically nothing about gears before I got into this project, and so there was a fair amount of research. Luckily, once again, metric for the win. They have this thing called module, which is the sizing of the gears, and it didn't take long before I discovered I needed a module 0.8 gear and rack for the front and rear standard movements. So you'd say, oh, well, just go and order some module 0.8 gears and rack and you're good to go, that's all you need. Unfortunately, I live in Australia. If I lived in America, I could get onto McMaster Car and I could order module 0.8 gear and rack and have it to me probably within the day. Not so much in Australia. I was able to find a hobby store that had one 0.8 module gear in stock. I ordered it, assuming that they'd probably get some more in stock and I can order those. To this day, they are still out of stock. So this camera actually has got one purchased gear, and the rest of them I built myself. How did you do that? you might ask? Well, when I realized, or at least I thought there was going to be a bit of a delay on the gears, I was a bit worried, because I knew that I needed to get the registration of the gears perfect so that the front standard, and the rear standard for that matter, would move precisely for focus. And in the 3D modeling, I needed all of those things to line up, and I needed them now. So I got onto McMaster-Carr, and they have 3D models or step files that you can download of all of the things you can purchase from McMaster-Carr. So I may not be able to buy the part from them, but I can get the 3D model from them. My theory being is I would at least have the 3D model that I could use as a reference for working in Fusion, and then later on down the track purchase from somewhere in Australia the correct gears. So I was able to download the gear and the rack, the step files, and add those into my 3D model. Interestingly enough, I 3D printed them, because when I was doing the mock-up process, I printed off all the different parts, and they worked exceptionally well. So much so that not only do I not have purchased gears in here, I actually got the gears 3D printed in aluminium when I got all the other parts done. But I haven't actually added those to the camera, because the PLA printed ones seem to be working so well, and there seems to be no point to pull apart the camera to replace the gears. Now, yes, obviously PLA gears will wear faster than aluminium or brass gears will, but because there's such a small amount of actual movement on the gear that's being done on a day-to-day basis, this probably will get racked back and forth half a dozen times, maybe a dozen times in a year. But other than that, the base came together fairly quickly. Some of the only parts that are not 3D printed are the aluminium on the side here. I really added that to be, if I'm completely honest, for looks. The whole unit was structurally rigid enough without the aluminium there, but the Shen Hao has it, and it looks nice, and so I added that there. And also the top plate that retains the front and the rear standard gears, that part I did do in PLA, and it works fine, but I decided it looked nicer in aluminium. And also it gave me a chance to learn the process of creating brushed aluminum or aluminium. And so yeah, I sort of watched some internet videos on how to make brushed aluminium, and it worked incredibly well. So that was that. The last thing that is on the camera that is not 3D printed is the Arca plate. So I've got an integrated Arca plate on the base. I was a little worried that being that this is the actual base plate is actually only 1.5 mil PLA, so it offers no strength whatsoever to the camera. It really just holds all the other parts. I was worried that I didn't have anywhere to bolt this part to. In the Shen Hao, it has a block of wood that literally goes down the middle, as far as I can tell. So what I ended up doing is I sandwiched 2 plates of aluminium in the base there and the top here, and that has made an incredibly strong connection there for the Arca plate, so that the camera will attach to the tripod and is incredibly stable. Which then gets us to the bellows. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, you will know that my challenges that I have had with making bellows from scratch. In my previous camera, that was the one area where I admitted defeat. I tried 3 times to make a set of bellows. The first one was a complete abject failure. The second one technically worked, but was very ugly. Third one was functional and I actually used it once or twice, but I realized it didn't match the rest of the camera. It didn't match the quality of all the other work that I'd done, and so I actually gave in and ordered a set of custom bellows for that camera. Not my proudest moment. However, when it came to this camera, ordering bellows online was not going to be an option, because it is a non-standard format, the 617. You can't just purchase pre-made bellows online. As such, I did do some research to find out if companies that would custom make bellows, and it was going to cost in the realm of $300 to $400 US to get a good pair of bellows created. That was too much, and so I decided no, I can do it. I just need to focus. I need to break down each and every single step and learn from all of my previous multiple mistakes. And the takeaway from it is this. When making bellows, precision is very key, far more than I could have ever thought. You need to be sub-millimeter accurate if you can. And the second thing is, each and every part needs to be thinner than you think it needs to be. I was thinking of actually making a video showing how to make the bellows, because the process that I went about learning how to do it consisted of, I got about 6 different internet videos that each showed a little bit but not everything, and sort of sticking that together in my brain, and then I had to learn a lot on top of that. So if you guys are interested, I don't know how many people out there really want to learn how to make bellows, but if you are interested, drop a comment, and if there's enough people, I will go through the painful process of making another set of bellows. So once I had the bellows sorted, it was now down to the rear section of the camera. And this is probably the area with the biggest change from a Shen Hao camera. I decided that I didn't have enough reference material of the rear film cassette to make my own. I also decided that, seeing as my film cassette design for my previous camera had been quite successful, I thought, well, why reinvent the wheel? I might as well reuse a lot of the modeling that I'd done for my previous camera and then just integrate it into the rear standard, seeing as I'm going to be designing my entire rear standard from scratch anyway. And so that's what I did. So on the face of it, this is like a Shen Hao. It has a lot of the similar characteristics of the Shen Hao, but it is slightly different. You're going from the top down. Handle, even that's handmade. I purchased a leather handle online. It was all pleather. It looked terrible. I previously had some fun making my own camera straps, and so I'd sort of started to dip my feet into the water of leatherworking, and so I decided, oh well, everything else of the camera is custom, so I made my own leather handle for the camera. And you'll see once again some little 3D printed but in aluminium catches. Once again, I did these in plastic PLA and they worked fine, but I got them printed in aluminium as well. And then you've got the ground glass. The ground glass, interestingly, this is like the 5th version of this ground glass. I had it so that the ground glass was just the size of the 617 frame. In fact, here it is now. I had it where it was just slightly larger with a probably 5mm edge around it to hold the glass in place. And that was wonderful and worked well, and I made some ground glass, and when I was testing the camera out, I realized that when I was using the loop to look at the frame, I couldn't get the loop up to the edges into the corners, because the loop's round, it would hit these edges, and so I couldn't really see the 4 corners and even bottom parts of the frame. So I reprinted for the 8th time and made it larger. So the ground glass is actually significantly larger. You can still see the window area, which is the actual 617 frame though. But it was pretty much standard ground glass. So moving on to the actual film cassette, you can just move the ground glass out of the way as you would. And you'll see here, this is the updated version of my film cassette, so to speak, from my previous camera. It was a fairly simple process to update this to work with this camera. Realistically, all I had to do was lop off the top and the bottom parts of the design that were designed to cover the half plate film area. And so it actually ends up being smaller and easier to 3D print, interestingly enough. I also added some quality of life changes that I'd been meaning to do to the previous camera. I just never got around to it. Previously, I had little locking cams at the top and the bottom in place, and I decided to change it to these little side locks instead. Realistically, the cams worked fine, and I had absolutely zero problem with light leaks or anything like that. But this just seems like a nicer design, and works pretty much the same as my other film cassette. No real changes to this other than my laser cut film window, which makes absolutely no change to the way that it functions. Even the felt, the little hole there for the felt, I purchased a cutting tool to cut a perfect circle in the felt. Once again, makes absolutely no difference whatsoever to the functionality of the unit, but as with everything else in this camera, I decided I want everything to be as good as I can possibly do it. So it's pretty simple to just screw these in, and that retains the film cassette. And realistically, with the 617 cameras, you're not changing film that often. Dark slide, nothing really changed with the dark slide. I extended the length of the little handle there just to make it a bit easier to pull it out. But other than that, this film cassette has already been tested and works quite well on my old camera, so there wasn't a lot of work needed to that. However, the way it interfaces with the camera is a little bit different to the Shen Hao. The Shen Hao basically has these two little metal catches there, and that works fine for them. I actually made a slightly thicker lip there, and so what that does is that sort of gives me a really nice strong registration to hold the film back in place and take my photos. And then just undo these, and you've got your ground glass. The last sort of major part of the camera is the rear standard mechanism. If I rotate this back a little, this is also somewhat different to the Shen Hao. The Shen Hao has this quite complex sort of lever system where it's got these spring steel sort of levers that sort of hold it in place. Once again, it seemed overly complex for what I needed, and I decided there was no real way I could do it in 3D printed aluminium because it wouldn't have the springiness necessary. So I just added these locking nuts like so, and I can still move the standard exactly the same as you would the Shen Hao, but it's functionally a little bit easier to build. Same with the front standard. If I unlock these, I do have some rise, and I do have a little bit of tilt if I need it, but I don't foresee me needing that to begin with anyway. I think I'm going to learn the front standard movements before I start messing around with the rear standard movements. So then that begs the final question: how much did it cost? The final print of all the PLA parts used about 1.5 kilos of PLA. That's including all of the supports for printing it. So realistically, probably about $30-ish, $40 of PLA was used to print the camera. The aluminium parts, there's probably about $10 worth of aluminium from the local hardware store. Not really all that. All the screws and thumb screws and knobs here, all up. Once again, it's hard to give you a number because a lot of these I had to order in bulk just to get the particular part I wanted. But realistically, I think when I looked at sort of adding up all of my costs, there's probably about $100 worth of hardware on the camera that I purchased, even though I have spares. I may need them if I lose a part. The leather for the handle was another $10. The aluminium 3D print was probably the most expensive part, or definitely was the most expensive part of the camera. That ended up costing about $300 US. However, you know, I was pretty happy with that considering how well it has worked. I am interested to try some of the carbon fiber resin or FDM printing that you can do. My printer doesn't really support carbon fiber, so I'd need something like a Bamboo A1 or something like that. In fact, I think Bamboo have just released a very high-end carbon fiber filament that's, I think it's like $100 and something US for 1 kilo. But I'd be really interested to see how how rigid that is, because it may well be possible that the entire camera can be 3D printed from either carbon fiber or just regular PLA rather than having to go to aluminium. So that's something I might do in the future. Being that I have the 3D models now, it's a fairly simple process to make another iteration of the camera, or in fact print a part and replace that part on the camera. So it's one of the benefits of creating my own model here is that the entire camera I can pull apart and change and add and modify very easily because I have the entire 3D model in the computer. Bellows cost about $30 in materials. I did use E6000 glue for the sticking the bellows together, and also for attaching the bellows to the camera. I used the black E6000. I find that that's got it's the strongest, but it's also can be removed if you need to. In one of my previous attempts, I used super glue. That was a terrible idea. So all in all, I'm probably looking in the realm of about $400 to $500 Australian, which is about $300, $350 US for the entire camera to build it from scratch. So I'm pretty happy with that. I think, you know, it's similar money that I spent on the previous camera, and I now have a full Shen Hao style 617 camera. So that's about it for now. I'm going to go off and use this camera and take some photos and have some fun, and probably not load up Fusion for quite a while, because I've definitely hit my limit of 3D modeling for the time being. So all that means is, until the next time, say hi to your dog for me.